The knock came at the worst possible hour, when daylight was bleeding out of the valley, and the cold had begun to claim its share. 3 lives stood on the other side of a door that had stayed shut for years, and one man was about to learn how easily silence can be broken forever. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The last sliver of daylight slipped behind the ridgeline, leaving the valley wrapped in a dull grey half-light. Where snow clung stubbornly to the shadows and the tall pines, stood dark and unmoving, like sentries holding their breath. Inside a small log cabin tucked deep into the Colorado territory, Rowan Pike sat alone, the steady scrape of steel against stone filling the quiet. He was sharpening a knife, slow and methodical, his movements guided more by habit than necessity. He lived alone out here, far from town, far from roads that carried gossip and gunfire. 33 years old, broad-shouldered, weathered by years of hard riding and harder choices. Rowan had once scouted ahead of cavalry, patrols and broken wild horses for ranchers who paid in coin and silence. But he had grown tired of both. He had seen enough blood spilled over lines, drawn in dirt and pride masquerading as principle. Now his purpose was simpler. Cut wood, keep the fire alive, endure the winter. He wasn't hiding from grief, the way many men did when they disappeared into the hills. He wasn't running from a dead wife or buried children. His solitude was deliberate, chosen. He had learned that quiet was worth more than money, and distance was often safer than loyalty. He had no family waiting for him, and he wanted none. He built the cabin with his own hands, raised his fences board by board, and made a point of staying clear of soldiers and settlers alike. The world could tear itself apart without him watching. The knock shattered that belief. It came sharp and hurried, then again louder, as if whoever stood outside feared he might decide not to answer. Rowan's hand froze mid-stroke, the knife hovering above the whetstone. His pulse kicked hard in his chest. No one came this way. Not neighbors, not travelers. Anyone who knocked on his door after dark was either lost or desperate. He set the knife down carefully and glanced at the rifle propped against the wall. He didn't reach for it, not yet. But the thought pressed close, heavy and unwelcome. Another knock followed, firmer this time. Rowan stood, boots thudding against the wooden planks, each step measured and deliberate. He crossed the room and pulled the door open. Cold air rushed in, sharp and biting, carrying the smell of pine, snow, and long miles walked without shelter. 3 women stood on his porch. They were Apache, their faces drawn tight with hunger and exhaustion, their dresses torn and filthy from hard travel, bare feet pressed into the snow-dusted boards, as if numbness had already claimed them. The eldest stood at the front, perhaps 25, her long black hair hanging loose around her shoulders, thin leather strips still braided into some strands. Her deerskin dress was ripped along the seams, the neckline stretched and worn, exposing more than modesty would allow, though Rowan noticed it only in passing. Bruises marked her arms, dark and ugly against her skin, yet she stood straight, chin lifted, lips trembling from the cold but not from fear. Behind her stood the middle sister, younger, sharper, maybe 22. Her eyes flicked immediately to the rifle inside the cabin, calculating, measuring how fast Rowan might reach for it. It was a look he recognized well, the look of someone who had learned to expect the worst and prepare for it before it arrived. The youngest clung to them both, no more than 18 or 19, slight and shaking, her breath puffing out in pale clouds. Her eyes were wide with fear, but beneath it was something else, hope, thin, fragile, but there all the same. The eldest spoke first. Her voice was rough from cold and thirst, but steady. "We will obey. We will work. We will cook. We will serve. Just let us in." Rowan's fingers tightened on the doorframe. He felt the weight of her words settle into him heavier than the cold. He had seen Apache families chased from their land, hunted by settlers and soldiers alike, blamed for every raid, whether they were guilty or not. These women carried that history on their skin. They looked like people who had been pushed too far and refused to lie down and disappear. His mind moved quickly. If he let them in, he would be feeding 4 mouths instead of 1. Firewood, food, supplies were already stretched thin. Their presence could draw attention if word ever reached town. Settlers didn't tolerate Apache faces, especially not under a white man's roof. And yet, if he turned them away now, they wouldn't survive the night. He knew it with the same certainty he knew the weight of snow on his roof. Rowan's jaw set. His first instinct was to close the door. He had built this life to avoid exactly this kind of trouble. And now trouble stood barefoot on his porch, bruised and shaking. The eldest didn't beg again. She simply met his eyes and held them, daring him to decide. Something settled in Rowan's chest, heavy and final. He wasn't a man ruled by pity. Pity didn't keep anyone alive. But this wasn't pity. This was choice. Could he sit by his fire sharpening, steel, while 3 women froze to death a few feet away? The silence stretched. Then Rowan stepped back from the doorway and gave a short nod. No explanation. No welcome. Just enough. The eldest moved immediately, guiding her sisters past him. They slipped inside quickly, thin bodies brushing against his coat, carrying with them the sharp scent of cold leather and smoke. Rowan shut the door, the latch clicking softly into place. He turned back toward the fire as the women hovered near it, drawn by warmth like moths. Their eyes swept the cabin, sparse, rough, but safe. None of them spoke. Neither did Rowan. The fire cracked in the hearth. The wind whispered against the shutters. For the first time in years, Rowan Pike was not alone. The cabin felt smaller with 4 people inside, the air thicker despite the fire's heat. Rowan sat back at the table, the knife and stone untouched before him. He watched the women warm their hands, noticed how the eldest tried to hide the tremor in her fingers, how the middle sister positioned herself slightly forward, protective, how the youngest leaned closer to the flames, as if afraid the warmth might vanish. It was clear they hadn't eaten in days. Hunger hollowed their faces, lived in the shallow sound of their breathing. Rowan stood, went to the shelf, and took down a sack of beans and a strip of salt pork. He dropped them onto the table and pointed toward the pot hanging over the fire. "Food," he said. The middle sister moved at once, lifting the pot, filling it with water, setting to work without a word. Her hands were quick, efficient, practiced. Rowan watched as the smell of pork slowly filled the cabin. Questions crowded his thoughts. Where had they come from? Why were they alone? What had happened to the men who should have been with them? He didn't ask. The eldest caught his gaze and after a moment spoke quietly. "We walked many days. Our people gone. No place." Rowan let the word sit. Gone could mean many things. He didn't need details. He noticed their feet again, red and raw, skins split by cold. That told him enough. When the food was ready, the middle sister filled 4 bowls. Sliding the largest toward Rowan, he pushed it back. "Yours." The youngest stared at him as if unsure she had heard right, then accepted the bowl with both hands, sipping like it was the most valuable thing she had ever held. Something shifted inside Rowan then. Not softness, responsibility. Later he tossed a blanket near the hearth. The sisters curled together on the floor close to the fire. Rowan stayed at the table staring into the flames. He hadn't bolted the door. That mattered. The night settled deep and quiet. As the sisters drifted into uneasy sleep, Rowan listened to their breathing and understood that tomorrow would not look like yesterday ever again. Morning broke clear and hard, sunlight spilling across the valley and catching on the frost like scattered glass. Rowan stood outside the cabin, axe resting against his shoulder, and listened. Inside there was movement, quiet voices, the sound of life continuing. He realized then that the silence he had built his world around was gone. And it wasn't loss he felt, but balance. The eldest stepped into the doorway. The blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, the mountains reflected in her dark eyes. She did not ask to stay. She didn't need to. Rowan nodded once, the same way he had the first night, and that was enough. Winter stretched long, but the cabin held. Meals were thin, but shared. Laughter came softly at first, then more freely. The sisters worked, not as guests, but as part of the place itself, and Rowan found that the weight he carried felt lighter when it was no longer his alone. When the snow finally began to melt and the valley breathed again, no one spoke of leaving. Some doors once opened were never meant to close. And in a land built on blood and loss, 4 survivors carved out something rarer than peace. They built belonging,